Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Vince, and I've been doing admissions since 1989 and college counseling since 1998 in California.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Vince and I will continue our conversation with our final part about a Wall Street Journal article entitled, Ivy League Degrees, Once a Badge of Honor, Now a Potential Liability in Some Job Markets. For a question from a listener, Lisa and Linda will answer a question from a mom of a transgender student who is looking for resources to help her assess if a college is a good fit for her student. And for our interview, Ben Neely, the Chief Academic Officer at Revolution Prep, is interviewed by Linda on the topic of helping us understand the new digital ACT, and that's part 2 of 3. And the College Spotlight is the final part of Kevin Newton's series on safe universities outside the United States.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Friends, Vince and I continue our discussion about how some employers who used to love Ivy League grads have soured on hiring them. Now, these institutions have great history. They have a lot of talent.
Yeah.
They have a lot of connections. They are not dying and they are not going anywhere.
No.
I don't want to oversell it.
Yeah, don't oversell it.
Yeah, I don't want to oversell it. But there is a shift that's happening out there. And I see it with the public, it's like, some of it is that whole thing on college. Like, I got someone I'm interviewing coming up on the whole topic of is college worth it? But people are certainly saying is $100,000 worth it if I'm going to have to pay that.
Right.
And they think these are the first schools that they think about. And I do see a backlash to that like, why would I do that now when I could go, and whatever, lots of things, right? I can have football and fun and less stress.
Right.
And less stress on my kid. Maybe they get a higher GPA. Maybe they do better. Law school, med school, whatever. And maybe I pay $40,000.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'm seeing is I am seeing a shift towards schools that were, towards schools that were Ivy adjacent. I mean, even, Grinnell, it's not a slouch. And Santa Clara, it's sitting in the middle of Silicon Valley. Like there's so much value there in both its location and its potential. And you're right. I think that I did feel this year that some students were not just driven by the percentage of students who were admitted or not admitted, but they were really trying to find schools where potentially they were able to participate in discussions where there was some openness and the ability to not shut down individuals right away because they have a particular belief about something. But I think there is a shift, but I'm not sure yet that people are shifting that far down yet, because Northwestern and Duke and Grinnell and
Vanderbilt, Notre Dame are really tough places to get into.
We're below 10%.
Well, there's a difference between our kids adjusting to not aspiring to go to highly selective schools. No, I'm not saying that.
Right.
I'm just saying that I feel like they're defining it broader than they once did. And not that those schools were not hot before, but I'm seeing people select, like when they're trying to decide, would I want to ED to Penn or Northwestern? Like Northwestern's winning a lot of those battles.
Yes.
If I want Princeton or Duke, I'm going to go with Duke. Like, I'm just picking. I'm not saying those are always the two schools pitted against each other. I just picked a couple examples of schools.
Yeah.
But Santa Clara, that school's on the rise. Like our ups to Santa Clara are way up, and I'm talking about from very strong students.
Yeah, and they should be up because
I know
it's a great place.
it's one of the very few schools of that caliber that's not killer to get in. Wouldn't you say, Vince?
Yes.
Because there's
Yes.
still, it's like I was just there on September 17th. They have 3 colleges: arts and sciences, business, and the Levy School of Business, and then they have engineering. And so their admit rate per college, because they admit in a college, it goes from the high 40s to the mid 50s. But it's still a place where we see them taking, A B students.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and there's just not a lot of places like that with their job connections,
And
their
the
graduation
facilities.
rate, their facilities, their happiness of their kids, their beauty of their campus.
Yeah.
It's a short list. Like a lot of the schools I had that were like that on my list before, they're gone.
Yeah,
Like
I hear
Richmond
you.
used to be like that. That was a hidden gem.
Ugh, Richmond, no more.
I know.
ED 1 or 2 or don't
Or
bother.
bust. It's pretty rough. Yeah, the new administration doesn't look at EA the way the Gil Villanueva
No.
regime did 3 years ago. It's just really changed. I feel Trinity is one of those schools in San Antonio. It's still a total gem
It's a
and
gem. Such a great school.
tremendous resources, and it's still not killer to get in.
No, but it's gonna get there. It's you have UT, Rice, and Trinity, and then SMU and TCU are in play too.
LMU is really, I don't know how the fires are going to impact things, but because I do wonder about how that, like, even what's yield going to be like for these LA schools in regular, like, sheesh, a lot of people don't want to deal with that, but
At Pepperdine, it's going to be rough, but I think LMU and UCLA and Oxy and the Claremont colleges and Caltech will be fine because of where
well,
they are.
will they be fine though? They're going to be fine in California, but like when someone's looking going all the way across the country,
Oh
I'm
yeah,
just talking about people I work with, and at first, even going to California itself is a really big deal. Do I want to go that far? Now you think about, well, do I want, like it's one thing when you live there and there's a comfort level. It's another thing when people are already had to, especially parents, maybe kids are a little bit more adventurous and willing to get away, and parents already weren't. They maybe were. It was a big pill for them to swallow, letting their kid do a 6-hour plane flight. I really do wonder how the Los Angeles schools are going to do with their yield from like East Coast kids or kids coming 4, 5, 6 hours away.
yeah,
I think it's going to be a problem, at least for this year.
yeah. I think you're right, but if you come and look, you'll see that although UCLA, you know, they've been sort of on the edge of they're online right now, but they've been on the edge of evacuation, and that would be really troubling if they lost that. But it's still on that side of town, like it's not that far away from the power
Yeah, but I
grid.
think you're probably in some insider's knowledge. Like, I'll give you an example. Like, so we went as a family, we went to Asheville, North Carolina for Thanksgiving in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
Did the whole big giant Airbnb family come, amazing time. It was so great. I immediately rented it for the next year. Let's do it again.
Mm-hmm.
My mom, my 86-year-old mom, looking on CNN, all the pictures of how Asheville got hit. I mean, my mom is really awesome, and she's never usually like still forceful. She's like, "You can go to Asheville, but I'm not coming." So she's the matriarch. So she basically changed her whole plans. So we went to the Outer Banks instead, and we had an amazing time. But the point is, your perception is based on what people are seeing on TV.
Right.
I think you're so close that I mean, you just rifle off all these neighborhoods and this and that and the other, and that's not the perception of somebody who maybe it's the first time even coming to California.
Yeah. 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 It sounds like everything is about to go up, which is not the case, but I could see why, because even in LA, you'd swear there were like 2 parts of LA, Altadena and the Palisades right now.
It'll be interesting within California to see if this helps a place like UCSD and San Diego State that are removed from it, or a place like Davis. that are like that feel removed from it.
But you
What do
still
you think?
have fire issues in San Diego, like throughout California. We're in a drought again. We haven't had rain for 8 months. The same issues that impact LA could hit San Diego, definitely Davis, definitely Berkeley. Like they're all we're in
Wow.
this torturous,
So the whole state is a tinderbox potentially. I'm just thinking of it as something from maybe parts of Orange County through to Malibu.
I mean, maybe Irvine and Santa Cruz are probably Riverside. I haven't been there in so long. I'd have to like go and look
I
at it.
got a client in Riverside, and they said everything's fine. It's like no issues at all.
Yeah, but it depends on where, what fire, what arsonist is
Right.
lighting
You're
stuff
talking
up.
about yeah.
Because if
Wow.
it's all a tinderbox, because a couple years ago they had those fires in Sonoma, that could have been Berkeley easily, and that whole place
Mhm.
just torched. It's just hills, and there it's like brush, light a match, and they everything's on fire. That's what happened in Palisade.
I'm just thinking, how did I take us off of you know
I don't even remember,
how did I take us off of
but
schools looking askance at Ivy League and I mean there were some really strong quotes in this article. Like the one you read, like no way in hell or whatever, I'm hiring somebody from one like there definitely was some people is a bias against those schools. Like I'm not saying
yes,
it's a majority,
hmm
but it's definitely a trend worth following.
yes, I agree.
And the thing about it is because of the expense of the schools, and not just even the financial expense. Of course, these schools have very generous need-based aid if you're under resourced, but if you're most kids that get in are not under resourced because it takes a lot of resources to have the type of resume to be competitive typically. So I feel like the bar is high there, not only the financial bar, but also it could be hard on your mental health
Hmm
because like the competitive situation you're putting yourself in. So while at one side you've got this newfound skepticism growing, it's a high bar. It's like all of a sudden there's problems in a car that's over $100,000, and you start hearing about mechanical problems in a car that's over 100. Well, that was already a high bar anyway. The car was super expensive
Right, right.
versus maybe like a $30,000 car. I don't know. Any final thoughts, Vince?
Again, another one to watch. Definitely a trend, but I think that other factors will have an impact on there. I still feel that if you went to Wharton, if you went to Northwestern, you went to Cornell, people have a certain respect for that, and it's not completely gone, but there is some people. There
Well,
are
there's
some
also a network too.
right, exactly.
Yeah,
So
network's not going away.
yeah, that's not going away. So but I think people have to be careful. And if you say you're going to deliver something and you don't, and you went to one of these schools, people will have an impression.
I just want to say something because sometimes when I talk about the network at those schools, one of the most powerful networks is your own state flagship, and you live in that state. That's a
Yes,
powerful network too,
yes,
because
yes.
there's so many thousands and thousands and thousands of those graduates in hiring positions, and I think sometimes I'm not talking about me personally. I recorded a segment, with Hillary not too long ago. We got into talking about the network at those places, and sometimes I think I don't bring the balance out of if you're in Georgia, it doesn't get much better than being a Georgia or Georgia Tech alum,
Hmm
and that's just true for pretty much every state.
Yeah, yeah. But good point. Good point. That's a hard door to get through in California. But thank you for this opportunity, Mark.
No, well, thank you, my friend, and I know by the time this airs, well, hopefully your surgery will be incredibly successful. You'll be on your way to recovery, and that cartilage issue will be fixed, and you won't have pain. Because boy, life with pain is just not good. I
It's
mean,
not
you used the
not good.
tooth example.
Hmm
I know you remember I had knee surgery.
hmm
Arthroscopic knee surgery. I mean, I literally It happened to me in Grinnell. Like Grinnell was not where I had the surgery, but Grinnell was where 1 second I walked 13,000 steps the day before at UChicago and Northwestern, touring both, and then I get to Grinnell and I get to my hotel room and I can't put any weight at all,
Oh,
on it, and you're like whatever it takes, like whatever you got to do, like I can't live this way.
right.
I
That's
tell you what,
where
it's really given me a lot of respect for doctors. I mean, because they change lives. I mean, I know when I had my surgery, they said like if I would have waited another week, it could have been sepsis because it was an
Oof.
infection that went down to the knee. But you know what? I remember hearing this sermon about, it was a really long time ago now because we were living in Dallas. So we left Dallas in 1995. So this had to be more than 30 years ago. But I remember it. So the guy was like, when I was younger, I used to really value like owning a house. So you know what I value now? My health. The older you get, the more you realize how precious your health is.
Yeah.
We only have one body. And, one of the things that I came to learn, even like with my knee surgery, so yeah, it was an infection in the knee,
Mm-hmm.
but so then they said it could be as simple as you get a cut in your finger and it gets infected and it goes down to the knee. But then thing I learned was that if your blood sugar is higher, then you're not producing as many of the platelets that fight off the infection.
Mm.
So to me, it was just like this fluke thing that could happen to anybody. And there's some aspect of it, but there's another aspect of it where it may have even been health related. Like maybe, Vince, I'm all over the place on this episode. We started with the Ivy League, and then we jumped to the fires in LA, and now we're talking about taking care of our health. But obviously you're on my mind with the hip surgery, and I appreciate you, by the way, sharing that too. You could have been really guarded, not shared that with our listeners, but people like it when you let them into your lives. So thank you for your transparency.
You're welcome.
All right. I'll be in
We'll
touch.
Talk soon. Take care,
buddy. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Friends, I'm super happy to say that Vince had a very successful hip replacement surgery, and he's rejoicing to be not in pain for the first time in about 12 months. So special thanks to all of you who remember to pray for Vince.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Hey, Linda, how is it going today?
Hey, Lisa. Things are good here in the frozen-in Midwest.
Yeah, we're in sort of the frozen South, but honestly, it's all melting now. We had like maybe an inch of snow and some ice, but I think it's all going to be gone in like an hour. So
I have plenty. I'm willing to ship you all of our snow and ice.
I think a lot of people here would be very excited to take it. So I'm not one of them. But anywho, well, today we have a great question from a listener, and let's just go ahead and play it.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for taking my question. I'm calling in today with a question as the parent of a transgender student who is a junior and currently working on a college list. I would love your advice on how to identify colleges with supportive communities and resources on campus, and also what to be thinking about in the broader community, state level, that campus is situated in, and how to make informed decisions as we're looking at creating that college list. Thanks so much.
So, Linda, what do you think? What are some resources that you recommend to students when they are looking for supportive environments?
Well, I appreciate the listener calling in with this question. And she asked about identifying colleges with supportive communities and resources on campus. And there are some broad websites that we can talk about. But like when you go to visit a college campus, there are some things I think that you can look for, or as you're doing your research. And some of the things are like, does the school know and allow you to have a preferred name in addition to your legal name?
Mhm.
What is housing like? I know that can be a
Right.
big one. Do they have gender inclusive housing? And some college campuses will have living learning communities for
Mhm.
LGBTQ students. Um, Gender neutral restrooms. Uh,
Right.
are they on campus? And
Mhm.
are they accessible? Because it's
Mhm.
one thing to say, oh, yes, we have gender inclusive
But if you have to walk
restrooms.
10 minutes, yeah, that's,
Exactly. Fifth floor, ancient histories building, down
mhm.
that dark, gloomy hallway. Um, Check on their non-discrimination policies, and do they
Mhm.
explicitly address trans students, gender identity, gender expression. Um, can you change your name? So,
Mhm.
as you are going through this, a lot of times you get that one ID and it can be difficult to actually change your name. And then, of course, student organizations on campus.
Mhm.
And, this is something that I look for when I'm on campus. Uh, what those, because most of them will have an LGBTQ
Yeah, right.
resource
Mhm.
center. So is it a welcoming place?
Mhm.
Is it its own building or its own area where students can come and gather and maybe have a respite? Um, or is it a couple of cubicles in a warren of
Mhm.
offices? So what does that actually look like? Um, I look to see what kind of events they have. You know, h- do they have a pride parade? How are they supporting students throughout the school year? Um, those are some of the things that I'm
Mhm.
thinking of. I'm just kind of
Yeah,
going on
no,
now.
I think those are all great ideas. I would say, like, if you are serious about a school, reach out to some of the leaders of some of these organizations and ask them. I mean, I think that the students they'll tell it straight to you and let you know how it's going on campus. The other thing I would say, and I'm sorry to say this, is that, it's private universities might be more of a stable environment than public universities. I was reading an article this morning, I think it was in the Chronicle of Education, about how DEI offices and practices are being eliminated in many state institutions. In our own University of Missouri, I think that they cut the funding for the Hispanic Music Festival, and um, the Black Student Union was not allowed to have a picnic at the beginning of the year called Welcome Black. And so these are all, this is a school that has traditionally been very well known. For
Right.
trying to be more inclusive. Well, after they weren't, after there were some very racist incidents, but they've been really trying for 10 years. And now, like, they're kind of limited by the state legislature, the board of trustees, and what they can do. And so I would really, if you're looking at a public university, that's the university doesn't get to make all the rules or the decisions regarding that. So really take a look at that. And things change as we have seen, like
Exactly.
values change, the tenor of the country changes. So in that sense, like private universities who might be more, stable, or that's part of their mission statement, it might be a safer bet. And I recognize that also might be a more expensive bet. And so that's, part of why I'm sorry to say this.
Yeah, I think the fact that things change and they can change year to year is important. One resource that I I think is can be helpful, and it's a blog. It's on Substack.
Hmm.
It's erininthemorning.com,
Hmm.
and that's Erin, Erin in
Yeah,
the
that's a great
morning.com.
Substack.
Yeah, and on there, she has adult and youth trans legislative risk
Hmm.
assessment
Hmm.
maps. So
Hmm.
you can see which states are friendly, because a lot of times those changes do start at the state legislative level.
Yeah. And then I know we were talking about one another independent educational consultant has done a lot of work in this area. Shout out to Robert Powers regarding all of his
Big shout out.
advocacy.
Mhm.
And he has a great website that he started called Campus Q that kind of compiles a lot of this information regarding legislative proposals, but also sort of about how things are going at different campuses. And I would highly encourage anyone who's considering this as an issue to check that out. It's a very wonderful resource.
Yeah, and that's
Q.
campus-q.com. Yeah, the letter Q. Terrific resources. And campuspride.org. Also, it's kind of like the granddaddy of
Yes.
resources, and has everything on there from schools that are welcoming to trans students, but also we'll talk about like gender inclusive housing, trans athletic policies. And as you're going through there, which schools will cover trans medical expenses? Because that can vary institution to institution as well.
Yeah. And, I think that that's obviously you have to go someplace where you're, that is a situation where you're going to need continued medical treatment and supervision, and you need to go someplace where that's readily accessible. And it can change. Like, and, again, in Missouri, like it's changing.
Right.
And, for my niece is trans, she's moving to Illinois because she kind of has no choice at this point if she wants to continue her treatment. So, there's just a lot of flux, and that's why I think this is a great question. And hopefully we've given some parameters to try to answer it.
Yeah. And I guess the last thing I would say, like with all students, if you can visit would be so important.
Yeah.
Do you feel welcome on this campus? Are you making connections? Do you see pride flags? I know I was on a campus tour last summer visiting multiple colleges, and the differences in some of the universities was stark. Coming in during Pride Month and seeing one bookstore was rainbows and pride flags all over the place. And the next university, there was maybe a shelf or two. And just thinking how I would feel seeing that makes a difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, good luck to our listener. I hope that your student finds the perfect fit in all ways, but certainly at a school that they feel very comfortable at and supported.
Yes. Thank you.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, it's time for part 2 of 3 of Lynda's interview with Ben Neely. Help us understand the new digital ACT. In part 2, Ben shares his opinion on whether the ACT can be ready with their technology for the launch. Ben talks about how making the science section optional will impact the composite score. Ben talks about how tricky the new rollout is when it comes to looking at superscores. And he tells us what superscores are if you're not sure. Ben and Lynda discuss whether the student that takes the science section can then turn around and have just the science section be optional. Ben discusses what the college folks are thinking in regard to the SAT. Ben and Lynda discuss how is a student going to know whether the ACT or the SAT is the better test when there is so much still unknown about this new ACT. Ben explains what a concordance study is, and he explains why both the ACT and the SAT are reluctant to do another concordance study. Ben explains what other changes are going on in the math section and the reading section with the new ACT, and Ben discusses the challenge of getting practice tests for the new ACT. Listen and enjoy.
If they're having difficulty finding schools, because when you say test site, I'm assuming that you mean schools and not independent loan test centers. Is that realistically going to change by September? Or
yeah, I think so. Yeah, so it's certainly a lift from a development standpoint to change the way the software works, right? So that it's not a local server and it goes out to the cloud and it works like it does for SAT. That's not nothing, but it's certainly something that an organization of ACT size with their resources, I have every belief they can accomplish that in a matter of months. And so I feel good that I would be surprised, and that this is not based on any insider info, but I would be surprised if they haven't cracked that by September of next year. I would say, I would guess that internally that is their hard deadline. And if anything, they're trying to get it done before then to be able to have some more field testing. But I'd be really surprised if that's not fixed by September of next year.
Okay. I'm going to trust you because
I hope so anyway.
It sounds a little cuckoo to me, but what do I know about rolling out software? If we could go back and talk about that science section, because that seems to be such a sticking point. What does that mean for composite scores? How?
Yeah. So this is an interesting part of the puzzle. So the composite score, which again differs slightly from SAT, where their total score is just a sum of the different sections. On ACT, they average the 4 sections. What they're going to do, and I'll start by giving you the September 2025 scenario, because again, I'll reiterate this a few times. I really think that's how we should be viewing the real launch date for this new ACT. It'll be so rare to find a test before then. So in September of 25, they are changing the composite calculation, and it will only be based on the math, reading, and English sections of the test. Then separately, if a student chooses to take the science section, they will get what's called a STEM score, which is, with some window dressing, it's effectively just the section score for that science section on that same 1 to 36 scale. But even if they choose to take all 4 sections, their composite as of September will no longer include the science section by default. And that's a pretty big departure, right? You think about a student who took the September test this year, September ACT in 24, their composite is defined as averaging all 4 sections. A year later, a student who takes the same, I'm taking the ACT, pencil and paper, the composite will no longer be defined as an average of 4 sections, but as an average of 3 sections. So that's a change that kicks in September. And I think it feels a little bit like one of those test nerd behind the scenes changes, but I actually think this change is one of the potentially stickiest and most thorny sort of changes that they're making in terms of what it will mean for higher ed and what it will mean for a lot of other things around this new test.
So will the highest possible score on the ACT now be a 27? Did I do my math?
Oh no,
right?
that's a great way. No, it'll still be a 36. So effectively, we're just going from averaging 4 different sections, each of which could be 1 through 36, to averaging 3 sections, each of which will be 1 through 36. So it's not like a weighted average decrease. So same scale. And that's, I think, actually part of one of the challenges is that what it means is that potentially, or not potentially, in reality, a 31 for a September 25 test taker on the composite and a 31 for a September 24 test taker on the composite mean 2 different things behind the scenes. It's a 31 on the surface, but for one kid, it included the science section, and for the kid a year later, it doesn't, despite still calling it the composite score.
So how does that flesh out for superscores?
I have no idea. I wish I had the answer to this question. So this is going to be one of those things we just don't know yet. I think it's already a little bit tricky if you're, so super scoring, and you have a very educated audience, but we'll do the quick refresher. Super scoring is that the process of taking different test sittings on different test dates and being able to mix and match and combine together the high water section scores for different subsections. I use the term Frankensteining together different parts from different tests. And even currently, ACT super scoring is not as straightforward to access as SAT is in terms of actual college policies. SAT super scoring is pretty widely accepted, the vast majority. ACT it's hard to put an exact number because these things change year to year, but it's quite a bit less common than SAT super scoring is. And so will this new test still be super scoreable by those same folks? How would they combine, let's say, the student who did manage to take a classic ACT in June and then the new ACT in September, and they took science for one but not for the other? Like, it boggles the mind to think what those policies could be. So my guidance would be, I would play it conservatively, and I would expect less flexibility in super scoring there across the different test formats for the classic versus new ACT.
And so you may not know this, maybe no one knows this yet. If a student takes the new ACT and they take the science, but they didn't get the score they hoped for, can they just elect not to submit that?
I don't know the answer to that question yet. That's actually really interesting. It would certainly, the way the test is structured now would seem to set students up to be more likely able to do that potentially. I actually think a lot of that is going to depend. Like, I would say this, I think ACT, if anything, my guess is that they will offer students every possible way to report scores. I think already, right, ACT has their own built-in super scoring tool. The real constraining factor is more, what do the colleges and universities accept, and what are they okay with, right? I think ACT will probably give students every tool in the toolkit as far as, don't show this score, show this score. But at the end of the day, the colleges and universities are the gatekeepers in terms of, we need to see this, or it's not okay for you to hide this, or what have you.
Well, and that's the $64,000 question, is what do the colleges say about this?
Yeah. So the answer right now is a whole lot of nothing. So it's a whole lot of crickets right now. And I actually don't blame colleges and universities for that. They, again, at least publicly, just found out about these proposed changes in July. So that's right about 4 months ago from when we're having this conversation. And in the world of, a lot of these colleges and universities have been around for, decades and decades and centuries in many cases. They don't tend to move really quickly unless they're compelled to, like they were with COVID. So I think we shouldn't really expect to hear much more for a while, just because the way their process tends to work, and I've talked to a couple of admissions folks around this, is they defer to their institutional research folks. They defer to their faculty and their committees who study this sort of thing with a fairly rigorous process, and they look at longitudinal data sets over many years, and then they come back with a recommendation that says, hey, here's what our policy should be for these reasons. And that takes time, and there's going to be disagreements in that process. Unfortunately, the other side of things, when we think about our students and our families, is, especially for our current juniors, they would need to know the answer to that $64,000 question soon, right? If you're making a testing plan that is sort of reasonably thought through for a junior, the time is now to have a sense for, here's the test I'm taking, here's when I'm taking it. And I have no idea when we're going to know. What I would say is that, if there are any folks in admission or enrollment management that are listening, and I do talk to these people as well, really, to me, it feels like you got to let folks know by September of next year. I think that for our current sophomores, right, when they begin their junior year in September of 2025, it ought to be known from every college or university that accepts the ACT how they feel about students not taking the ACT section, or taking it and choosing not to submit it, as you mentioned, right? Like every possible permutation. I think we'll have schools that let us know before then. But to me, that September 25 is like the hard, kind deadline where they really ought to let students know by then.
Yeah, I hope that is the case. And as students and families make decisions just on what tests they should take and then get scores back, because I know we've talked in the past where, take practice tests on SAT and ACT, see which you do better at. How are they going to know? Are the concordance tables going to be accurate to tell if you're doing better at the ACT versus the SAT?
That is a great question. So you heard me say a little earlier that this issue of the new composite score not including the science section was potentially one of the sort of stickier or thornier issues. So this comes back around to that point, which is, and again, I'm sure everyone would completely fall asleep if I tried to dive deep into the psychometrics of scaling and equating tests and between different test states and between different test formats.
You're
But
talking way over my head here.
over my own head, to be honest, that's not I do not have a PhD in this area. But what I will say as a layperson's explanation, so the concordance chart or table that you're referring to is a joint effort between two different assessment makers. In this case, it's College Board, who makes the SAT, and ACT Inc. that makes the ACT. And they collaborate by sharing data sets with one another. And through that, they're able to very rigorously come up with a conversion chart that says, hey, a 29 on the ACT, it corresponds to this scoring range on the SAT with a pretty high degree of statistical precision. Now, that concordance, to some extent, really relies on current and accurate data between those two test makers. And so it's fine if you don't change your test, if the blueprint for the test doesn't change, and you continue to make new test forms every year for 10 years, you can keep using that concordance theoretically for 100 years, as long as you haven't changed the blueprint. Where it gets tricky is sort of each change you make and how big that change is starts to threaten the accuracy of that concordance table. And the SAT's change to digital, already, I would say, it's worth scratching our chins and saying, should we still be using the same concordance? We are, right? So that concordance table that is currently out there was not modified as a part of the SAT's digital transition. And at least at the moment, there is no intention to change it with this new ACT transition. And again, I am not expert enough in the statistical details to be able to tell you, but I would say I've talked to some people who are, and I would say there is concern expressed that especially once you have the digital SAT change, and maybe even more so the new ACT change, where you're now removing an entire section of the test and trying to concord just at the composite ACT to total SAT, the validity there could be a problem. But at the moment, there is, because this requires collaboration, my understanding is SAT and ACT at the moment, at least, have not agreed to go ahead and do another concordance study for the new ACT concordant with SAT. That might happen. I certainly will put it out there in the universe and say it should happen. I hope it happens. Yeah. But I do understand that it takes a lot of money, a lot of time. There is a vulnerability there, right? Because what if you do this and it turns out that the numbers don't lie? They tell you that with the new ACT and the SAT, there's been a shift, a significant shift. And that will then lead to characterizations of like, oh, the SAT is easier, the ACT is easier. That could be very damaging to these organizations in terms of student perception. So I don't want to minimize how big of a deal it would be to do concordance study again. But I think by the time we have this new ACT without an entire section involved in the composite anymore, it's time to do another concordance table. But at the moment, the going word from both SAT and ACT is that they're going to continue to use the existing concordance table. And I actually think the people that will have a problem with that are the learned faculty at these colleges and universities that are advising admissions. I think they're going to have a real bone to pick with continuing to use that old concordance table despite all of these changes.
And I am definitely not comparing myself to those learned faculty. But it does seem with the changes to the SAT and now with these changes, it just doesn't seem quite right.
Yeah.
And I would, talking to students, I'm recommending until we know, just make sure you take the science section. But one of the questions that I get, when are we going to see practice tests? Are those out there?
For the new ACT, they are not. So what I have been told on some good authority is that the first new ACT practice test will launch in December. Now, that is not, publicly promised, but that is the word behind the scenes, is that they're working very hard at ACT. It will be in a digital format. It'll be free. Students should be able to access it through their ACT student account on ACT's website. And I think what I would expect is that first practice test will be faithful and accurate in terms of the questions, but the interface, I would expect there could still be some further changes to what they see in December from what the eventual digital interface looks like. But I think the promise is that the actual questions themselves, the reading, the math, the English, the science, will reflect the very small tweaks. Because besides just making science optional, ACT is doing a number of other more subtle adjustments to the test. The math section will now have 4 answer choices per question instead of 5. Some of the reading passages will see some very slight alterations. We don't have all of these details yet, but I think around the margins they are making a number of other little tweaks. Experimental questions, their sort of guinea pig field testing, will no longer be a separate section. Those will be stealthily embedded into a regular section, which is a good change. That actually shortens the overall testing experience. So I would expect a lot of those things that I just described to show up faithfully and accurately in this new practice test we're going to get in December. But I would just caution that the interface might see further tweaks between then and the April launch of the new ACT.
Friends, this concludes part 2 of Lynda's interview with Ben Neely. We hope you'll join us next week for the final part.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
Well, one thing, I haven't brought this up in the podcast until now, but I've been thinking about a lot is, to what degree are you going to see a decrease in international students coming over here? And to what extent is that going to impact the finances and the selectivity of certain schools? Because I don't know if I've talked on this podcast as much as I probably should have, but a lot of schools rely on international applicants to pay their bills. Full pay, a lot of times it can be an extra $5,000 or so in international fees. They've got to, show proof of money in the bank and all that before they come over. And a lot of schools, a lot of this, you saw this heavily during the, great financial crisis. And I saw some boarding school admissions as well, that schools have, over many decades turned to international countries as a way of paying bills and adding diversity to the student body. Now, they would sell it to the students as adding diversity, but one tell a lot of times is it was more than that. Is in some cases they took so many students that you could argue, well, that's not diversity when you're taking so many people
Right.
from certain places. That's now, what's the definition of diversity? But it was financial. And so, and then I have a school in mind, which I won't name, but if you were to look up the admit rate of this college, you would see an admit rate of in the 30s. So people who are very admit rate conscious think, oh, that's like respectable. They're denying more kids than they're admitting. I'm comfortable with that. But in private conversations, they've told me their domestic admit rate is in the 80s. Their overall admit rate is in the 30s because of the large swath of international students that apply, and they're not, of which their admit rate's quite low. So I'm concerned about the finances of U.S. colleges, and I know some schools are concerned about what's this going to do to our admit rate. And a lot of times people have to report that admit rate to a lot of people who are watching them, and they may not understand that. So anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I certainly do. And I believe it's with basis because we did see a decrease from 2016 to 2020, not only in students applying to come over from certain places, but also in granting of student visas.
So I don't know how much insight I have, but I have thoughts. Certainly on the UK side of things, because it's that time of year when the Guardian starts producing its underfunded UK university articles. Who's on the chopping block, and I really appreciate when parents send me that, because first of all, Mark, like you, I love having parents who are so plugged in. And second of all, it gives me a chance to, directly ask the universities, what are you thinking of? And most universities I've talked to overseas are thinking they're definitely going to see an increase in students applying from the US, and that they're going to, some of them are even willing to sweeten the pot a little bit, because you take some place like, let's give Newcastle some good press, because Newcastle is very generous with their merit aid for Americans, where for them it's a win. And I'm going to grossly simplify the numbers here, but say that an American student pays £10,000 more a year than a British student. That's a gross oversimplification. It's just because I did not go to math school, as my wife likes to say. If they offer a $3,000 scholarship, or £3,000 scholarship, excuse me, they're still netting £7,000 more than they would for a domestic student. So there is a lot of that. There are some UK universities, I will not name and shame, but they figure rather lowly in the league tables, which is one of the few times those things have any use, who will more broadly accept Americans because they pay more and they're struggling. Where I am interested in this is somebody who lives here in Texas, where we have some great public universities. And I'm saying this as a taxpayer, as someone who has, strong family ties to schools back east. My wife is God knows how many generations Auburn grad. I think that what we've seen, and I'm just, as an observer, Mark, you'd be the expert here. A lot of schools in the South have really marketed themselves as being a great place to live for 4 years. I mean, it drove me nuts, but it was a smart play. LSU put in a lazy river. And I that flew all over me. But for an 18-year-old, yeah, that sounds awesome.
That was one of our first, either our second or our third podcast we ever did. If our In the News article talked about LSU's lazy river, she brought back a memory from February of 2018 for me.
Well, I'm looking at this and I'm like, how many people are now not going to feel safe? Like, how is this going to hurt? I know we've had questions raised. I won't I don't think in our group chat, Mark, but in other group chats I'm associated with, how do I withdraw an early decision application from a competitive school in a red state? And, that's going to hurt a Vanderbilt. That's going to hurt a Duke. That's going to hurt a Rice. That's going to hurt Tulane. That's going to hurt Emory.
Now I'm going to push back a little bit on that.
Okay. I'm asking more than anything. So
yeah. I think that those places, the percentage of people that are going to withdraw an early decision is few. And also, this is something that my brother says, and he's right. It's really not so much red state, blue state, as it's urban, suburban versus ex-urban, rural.
No, I think that's fair.
So those places are not places that are really, really conservative. They're just not. And the people that apply there tend to know that. But I think the overall tenor, what we're talking about, is true. And there certainly are some people that just automatically, categorically rule places out. There's no doubt about it. And especially, like there's a lot of people that say to me, no Texas. There's a lot of people that say to me, no Tennessee. So, and some of them will say it for Georgia and North Carolina, purple places, or slightly pink, whatever you want to frame them. So I do think there's definitely reality there. But there's also people that I think are a little bit more sophisticated and say that, well, no, a place like Emory is way more, going to be way more blue than it's going to be red, for people for whom that's important. There's another side of it too. Look at Florida. Florida's had a huge influx of conservative-minded families because of certain positions. So that also may happen too. I don't know how much from other countries. But there's certainly, this thing can work both ways. We do need to wind down now, Kev. What are your final thoughts you want to share on this topic that you haven't shared?
I think, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's not surprising which countries are going to be the safest. Whether you're concerned about war, whether you're concerned about geopolitics, whether you're concerned about your human rights. And let me back up a minute. Thank you, Mark, for that clarification. There's a reason you do domestic admissions, and I need to stay overseas.
Well, I feel with a high degree of confidence that Vanderbilt, Duke, and Rice and Emory University will have increased applications. It's a conversation you and I will have sometimes. We'll say, listen, it's amazing how many people will say, I don't want to be in the hinterlands. I don't want to be in a rural state. I don't want to be. And then they're interested in Dartmouth and Williams.
Right.
So it's our experience that brand name trumps concerns about that. It can apply to other less brand name schools, but it tends not to apply so much to the brand name. Not saying it doesn't happen at all, but there's a number of other forces and factors those places have. Remember, these are all places in growing states. So there's other things that are kind of counteract that. So,
but I think going back to your question, party thoughts, just the places that, again, there are certain regions I would not recommend. Eastern Europe, certain parts of the Pacific Rim, closer to, if you want some really interesting geopolitical reading, because I know that everyone loves geopolitics just as much as I do, just Google 9-line China because it's fascinating. Certain places in the Middle East and North Africa, it's just things we have to be cognizant of. It sadly, I wish that crime and safety weren't an issue. I wish that issues of, for lack of a better term, respect wasn't an issue. But it is, on the whole, it hurts to say this, for a lot of places overseas that you're already typically going to be looking at, it is a rosier picture than what you're going to find at a lot of places here.
Evan, thank you so much. Thank you for suggesting this topic. Thank you for the complexity and nuance of which you approached it. I think it's great, the multifaceted lens through which you looked at safety, and I'm sure our listeners appreciated it. And friends, Kevin, I have a couple more things planned coming up for you that you're going to hear in the not too distant future. You may remember, if you heard his 4 Universities in London series, and we promised then there's 2 other that are in London and they're a little different. And so you'll be hearing that, and then we thought we'd also do something else that I think would be of interest, which is, what are the universities that are world-renowned, highly respected universities, but they're not as hard to get into as the similar type of universities over here. So those are a couple more things that Kev will be back to discuss in both of those segments we'll get in the 2025. So look forward to that, Kev. Thanks as always, my friend.
Mark, pleasure's mine. Thank you.
Friends, on Monday's episode, we have a special surprise. And I love my surprises, so you're going to have to tune in for that episode to get the surprise. And here and I are going to continue our deep dive on the question a listener sent in who asked, what do I get if I pay top dollar for a pricey elite school besides prestige? Is it worth it? We talked for at least 45 minutes, and we ran the first part of that discussion on episode 506, but we'll have the final part on Monday on episode 508. And friends, we'll have the third and final part of my interview with Dean Christoph Gutentag of Duke University, and the topic is understanding how Duke University makes admissions decisions. And friends, I close you out with a quote from the great Henry Ford. When everything seems to be going against you, remember that the airplane takes off against the wind, not with it. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us, and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stalianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.